Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group call. Before we get started with today's topic on field quality control, just wanted to remind everyone that today's session is recorded and will be made available on CSI's YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/CSIConstruction, all one word. That video should be uploaded later today or tomorrow. Well, you can look for the other 260 to 270 or so hours of additional content from both this practice group, the Contract Administration Practice Group, and other miscellaneous CSI educational programs over the last few years. With that, I do want to hand it over to David and Lewis to get started with today's session. So David and Lewis, over to you.
Well, thank you, Matt. This is Dave. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here with us this month. Gosh, here we are in June, finally. So we got through May. We had a grand total of 2 days in May without rain, and we're starting well in June. So we're hopefully turning the corner on the weather here. Lewis?
Well, it's a sunny day here in downtown Nashville. And I want to let everybody know that this particular session was inspired by one of our attendees last month, Rich Freewalt, who suggested a portion of what we're going to talk about today, and so we just built on top of that. So to remind everybody that if you have something that's that you'd like to have us discuss, why please send us an email and we'll try to get to that. And now I'm going to go back to David Stutzman, who you may not know this, but he's the anonymous author of Pungent Exclamations for the Amateur Plumber. David.
Say what? I must have lost that somewhere. You're going to have to explain that. I don't know if you want to explain it to our listeners or not. But okay. Today we want to talk about field quality control. It's been a topic that's been somewhat on the forefront with some of our clients, and that was one of the reasons when Rich Freewalt suggested it. I thought, gosh, it's actually pretty timely since we're getting this kind of discussion going on elsewhere as well. One of the things that we have been looking at with our own clients is just how far do we go with field quality control, and what are we really expecting to accomplish with the things that we're specifying for field quality control, and how do we take that and scale it as necessary for individual buildings or individual projects, because certainly they're not all the same. So we want to spend some time with you today and just chat about this a bit and see if we might be able to get some of your own comments and thoughts about how you're dealing with field quality control. Okay, so with that said, what we're trying to do is we spend a lot of time writing these specifications. We build in all kinds of requirements the contractor actually has to comply with, some of them directly related to products and some directly related to installation. And the field quality control is really about monitoring what happens in the field and how we can confirm that what's being installed meets the specification. So two different aspects, right, Lewis?
Yeah, wait just a second. Matt, one of our attendees says that he's not getting sound, David Metzger.
Yeah, I'll respond directly to David. For anyone else, I guess, that has this, chances are you're not hearing us. But if you have audio difficulties, it seems like it's going in and out. Best case scenario is usually to just log out and log back in. And sometimes there is a glitch in the GoToWebinar system accessing and working properly with your internet connection. But I'll contact David directly as well.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Well, we're going to talk about quality control, but it's always a good idea, I think, to refresh ourselves on the difference between quality assurance, which is a Part 1 section format subject, and that where we specify the procedures to assure that work will in fact comply. For example, installer qualifications, pre-construction testing, some of those kinds of mock-ups, the construction of mock-ups, whereas quality control is after the fact. It's part 3, and it's the procedures to verify that once the stuff has been installed, that it really is what was specified and meets all the requirements.
So I always like to look at the two distinctions. Is one, quality assurance is really the plan as to how to get to the end result, and quality control is the actual test, the verification, the inspection to assure that you complied with the plan.
Yes.
Okay. So what are we doing here then to make sure that we're writing both the plan and taking care of the verification? So things that we're seeing, that I'm seeing, that are coming more and more into use are industry associations. There are a number of them out there that are actually offering quality programs, and some of them are actually providing the actual inspection services as well as the quality programs themselves to confirm compliance with their individual standard that they've published. The first one that comes to mind to me is always AWI, because they've been doing this for a number of years, but we've seen some others come on the scene lately. One is the fire stopping contractors, who are now publishing qualifications and certification programs so that you can actually specify I'm going to get the fire stopping contract, FCIA certified contractor to be installing fire stopping, which should get you some level of quality control by knowing that they've already passed the program and the certification requirements. So, and we've had, I personally have been involved in another certification program that's just recently been started, the NCAA, NACC, I'm sorry, the North American Contractor Certification Program, and they're starting with the Glazers. And we already have a number.
I was going to say the Ghana, the Glazing Association of North America, already has certifications for installers.
Right, and this was one that's actually an independent program where it was a program run through an ANSI accredited provider, so that it's completely independent of any association. It's completely independent of any manufacturer or anybody else having a stake in the game. So it gives you this third-party, unbiased, are the manufacturer, or the, in this case, contractors, complying with industry established minimum requirements. And that's another way to be able to try to get to some level of quality control at your job site, because again, they're proving some level of competence before they even get to the site.
Before you go ahead, we had a couple of comments from the floor that I think we should share. Kevin O'Barron says, reminds us that Part 2 also has some quality control requirements, for example, shop fabrication and so forth, and that's certainly true. And Mark Gilligan has a really interesting insight. He says there is a disconnect between how the building code, Chapter 17 of IBC, uses the terms quality assurance and quality control. That basically quality assurance are activities undertaken by the owner, while QC is left to the contractor as part of means and methods. And so that's interesting that we may have to be competing with alternative definitions for those terms.
Well, that's interesting too. Thanks for pointing that out, Mark, because I want to go back and look at Chapter 17 now that you've said it, because that does throw a different kind of a wrinkle in how we're perceiving quality control and quality assurance. And that that
because
may influence how we have to write.
Because one of the things that we normally have to do in the field quality control article is to state who's going to pay for any testing or third-party inspections. And sometimes it's assigned to the contractor, and sometimes the owner pays for it directly. But let's go on now. Quality practice standards.
All right.
Oh, I didn't mean to.
You want me to go back now that you? Okay, yeah. I see. You want to go talk about this? All right.
We discussed all these things, but
the quality practice standards. I'm sorry, the connection must be a little bit delayed. Go ahead, Lewis.
I just say I thought I interrupted you before you completed your thought.
No, go ahead. So what are you thinking? You brought up the point about who is paying for quality assurance or quality control programs. How does that have any influence?
Well, of course, it's my understanding that the IBC, that the special inspections that are required by IBC have to be done by a third-party inspector or testing agency that is employed by the owner. It cannot be done by the contractor, which would be kind of like the hiring the fox to guard the hen house sort of thing. But other required tests and so forth, many owners would just assume the contractor hire an independent agency to do them, so that more of the costs are rolled into the actual construction budget and the contract sum, rather than the owner having to pay for them separately.
And we see the owner suggesting the contractor be the one engaging the test agency primarily on publicly bid work, so because they only have one pile of money to draw from.
Yeah, there may be some, I hadn't thought about that. It's been a while since I've done a public an agency project. Good point.
And in our neighboring state, Pennsylvania, if we happen to have a publicly bid state project run through the Department of General Services for the state, would you guess who is responsible for those special inspections and field quality control?
Not the AE.
Yes, the architect. The architect the architect is responsible for hiring the test lab.
So you have to build that into your fee.
Yes.
Or do it as an additional service. Interesting. I had not run into that.
Okay. So who can we get to actually do some of this testing? We've already started talking about some of these things, but Lewis, I think you probably have some additional thoughts on this limitations of authority.
Well, of course, we've already talked about are these the persons who are doing the testing and inspecting are the owner's agent, that is, the owner pays directly for their service. Is it the contractor? And then into the limitations of authority. But before we discuss that, one of the first tasks that was assigned to me when I moved to my present position is that one of our architects had done a suburban office building for a developer, and when the pricing came back, especially on the third-party tests and inspections, the developer complained that it was about twice as much as he was normally used to spending for that type of building. And so I was assigned the task to go through and see what we could eliminate to get it back down to a more reasonable level. The problem is that the project architect, who was editing his own specs, had used master spec, and a lot of folks who do that don't realize that master spec has to have everything in there, from a multi-building campus for GSA to a a corner gas station or a branch bank. And so there's a lot of things in there that you need to exercise some professional judgment as to how important they are and how critical they are. And so this project architect, who's no longer with us, had the attitude if he didn't understand it, he'd leave it in.
Interesting. So since the contractor is obligated to follow the spec, and since the spec is requiring every imaginable test and inspection, of course the cost was astronomical.
It was insanely expensive. Well, let's talk about the limitations of authority. Whoever is paying for the inspections or tests, there are certain limitations. They're not allowed to interpret contract documents, not allowed to waive or alter the requirements, and they cannot themselves directly approve or reject work of contract. So in all of these things, they advise the architect, engineer, and the owner, but they can't do them directly. And most the agencies that I've run into are very familiar with these limitations and don't try to stretch them.
So are you saying they actually provide advice if they're out on the project site, conducting a test, observing the work?
Advice in the sense that the test results may result in something that they say, this really isn't right. And in their reports, they may make some limited recommendations, not telling the contractor necessarily how to fix it or even the architect engineer how to respond, but just offering their advice as to whether or not the work is appropriate.
Okay, so I see them more as reporting only, that they would conduct the test, they'd report the results, they might comment on results being outside of the contract requirements.
That's
but
what
not,
I mean.
But not actually providing any specific advice as to what to do about it.
And that's exactly what I mean.
Okay, because there might be, if we think about some of the other, I put that in context with a test and inspection, like laboratory kind of a service. But there are other services that are provided that might fall into advice. For instance, a registered roofing inspector or waterproofing inspector, because now they have some level of expertise in the particular field that they're actually inspecting. They may be able to offer some advice to deal with specific project conditions.
Yes.
So would we expect them to be in the field providing that advice to the contractor, or is this something that comes back in report form that the architect tries to deal with at some later state?
Yeah, it has to come back to the AE firm. They really should not even informally talk to the contractor much about their findings. And sometimes that advice is saying, we need more testing, that it's inconclusive.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn the tables a little bit more on you and see what you think about this one. So what if
No, it's my job to ask you the embarrassing questions.
Okay, so if we have a manufacturer's field rep that's on the site trying to ensure that we'll stick with roofing, because it's a great example, to ensure that the roofing is being installed according to the manufacturer's instructions, and he observes something that makes it either difficult to comply with the constructions or impossible to comply with the standard manufacturer's constructions, is he able to issue advice to the contractor as to how to deal with that, to allow him to proceed, keep the roof watertight, and maintain the warranty?
Well, Elias, it's funny you should ask that question. Elias Saltz just sent in a comment that if the field inspector is not independent, but is instead a manufacturer's field inspector, such as roofing, they have some authority to tell their the subcontractor that they are working with, how to proceed. Or actually, Elias put that in the form of a question, but I think that that's certainly very appropriate, that if the manufacturer is going to warrant the work, then that technical representative certainly has the authority to be able to advise the contractor on how to accomplish the work so that it will meet the requirements for warrantability.
Okay. What if, okay, so now I'm really turning the tables here, Lois. What if he issues instructions that revise the contract documents?
Then the contractor has to turn to us and say, okay, well, what do we do? Or perhaps make a proposal for, but as we've stated, nobody can change the contract documents except the owner and the contractor. Even we can only advise and help administer change orders, but we can't unilaterally change the contract.
Okay, so have I punished you enough on this?
Okay. And we have a couple of other comments from the floor. Karen Wood says one that we left out of that last slide, or the slide before last, is commissioning agent and where they fit in. And you're right, Karen, we'll have to address that. Kevin O'Barron says, results of all quality control, whether an inspection or not, that are required by the contract need to be submitted in writing. And of course, you're absolutely right, Kevin. Everything needs to be in writing. And Tommy Smith, our good friend from Memphis, says failure to comply with the manufacturer's instructions would be a code violation. He even put 2 exclamation points after that. And I'm not sure about that. Is that true?
I don't know about that, because where the manufacturer's instructions may not be entirely consistent with code or may go well beyond code.
Well, certainly if you're relying on the evaluation reports from the ICC evaluation services, then they would have to comply with that document for sure. But Tommy sent in another statement that, yes, well, Tommy, if you think about it, send us the chapter and verse for that assertion, and if you can't find it right now, we can talk about it later. But back to you, David. Let's talk about field tests and inspections. Why do we do them? Who's going to do them? And how are they done?
Well, I mean, the first one, Tommy already hinted on it, that one of the very good reasons is because the code requires it. Chapter 17 and IBC certainly requires the special inspections, and there are a number of other things that are also required. For instance, you would not close up your walls with all the plumbing concealed without having tested the plumbing for leaks. You wouldn't close up the walls without having tested the electrical wiring for continuity and ground. So there are a number of code requirements that would certainly suggest that we should be doing field test and inspection. And not all of those are normally assigned to an owner. It's things that would be required of the contractor to even be able to call for permit inspection.
Okay. Now, warranty requirements, that's one of those things that our listeners may want to think about when they're writing specifications is that for some manufacturers will waive or do not require an inspection to issue a warranty depending upon the size and complexity of the project. But if you're doing even a small project like a branch bank or something, you may want to have that level of confidence or verification that the roof has been done correctly, and so you'll need to specify that specifically in the roofing spec section that a warranty inspection is required, whether or not it's required by the owner or by the manufacturer.
Okay, and good practice. I want to put a different spin on good practice.
Okay.
So what about risk reduction? I think that's probably a more powerful reason for doing field inspection. So if you think about the architect's exposure, the owner's exposure, why would we not field test things like roofing to make sure that it's not going to leak, wall assemblies to make sure that we're actually meeting the specified performance for air leakage, water leakage, to make sure that we're not building in problems with the project.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you, but risk avoidance is negative, whereas good practice is positive.
Yes, but risk is a great incentive.
It's a great motive. Sometimes
yes,
it's a better motivator than wanting to do things right.
Yes, and then just before we went on the air, I added mock-up compliance. We're seeing a number of projects being much more insistent about using mock-ups, especially for building envelope assemblies. And they're becoming much more complex than they have been in the past, especially with rain screen assemblies, to make sure that all of the parts and pieces come together well. And we spend a lot of time and effort trying to assemble the mock-up. We presume the contractor is actually going to follow the approved mock-up. And what I find even myself doing is we're never really saying in the project specifications that we're actually going to inspect the completed work for compliance with the mock-up.
No. What I often do is I'll put a subparagraph under the mock-up requirements stating that an accepted mock-up will be the comparison standard for remaining work. Implies that, but that maybe is not quite as forthright as you would like.
Not quite as direct as saying it in Part 3 under field quality control.
That's absolutely true. I've also just recently, within the last couple of months, started adding a paragraph to mock-ups that are assemblies that involve multiple products to require electronic photographs at different stages so that we can view have a record of the concealed conditions that is available to us for when we are observing the installation of the next window.
That's an interesting idea. And you're asking the contractor to document?
Just to provide those photographs.
As opposed to relying on the architect's CA staff to be out in the field and take hundreds of photographs, whatever you need.
Well, you might not be there during the construction of the mock-up.
Aha. We could ask for notification.
Yeah, because even if... Yeah, but are you really going to stand around for the next 2 days while they do a mock-up, for 2 full days while they do a mock-up of the exterior wall assembly? Maybe.
Oh, you would love the time out of the office, I'm sure.
I probably would, because I seldom get out, but we need to catch up with a couple of comments from the floor.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sheldon, our old buddy from way up north says, let's see, I just had it. The further you go beyond, quote, comply with manufacturer's instructions, end quote, the more likely you'll have problems in the field. And that's absolutely true, although it's surprising on a project where I was hired by an attorney for forensic investigations, and no, it was a claim against us, come to think of it. And the contractor was making the argument, was somehow trying to make an argument that he was not obligated to have installed the window that failed according to the manufacturer's recommendations. I said, that's crazy. Why would you think we wouldn't want it to be installed the way the manufacturer said so? But they actually tried to say that with a straight face.
Did you require that? Was that stated in the spec?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, if nothing else, it's in the general product execution requirements in Division 1, but master spec sections state it over and over and over and over and over and over. Rosa Cheney says that if we see IBC 1506.1, that talks about materials and scope, and it requires that they be applied in accordance with this chapter and the manufacturer's instructions. So,
that was the reference we were looking for from Tommy.
So that's one of them. There may be others.
More questions, comments?
Yeah, a couple. Mark Gilligan says unique evaluation requirements are possibly contractual but not code. And of course that's right. There are lots of tests and inspections that are not required by code but are prudent. Kevin Cheney says, I would think that a third-party inspector hired by the owner would not have authority to direct work, but have the authority to report deficiencies only. And that's, we agree with that basic concept, Kevin, and you said it very well. Mike Smith says, photography. We would want to be cautious about reviewing photos, taking photos. The photos would need to identify exactly what you need to observe. If not, could be a litigious item. Well, again, you're just asking for progress photos and of it as it's going up. And I don't go into any great detail, but it would be handy on Windows, for example, to have a photograph that shows the flashing with end dams before they set the sill tube in place and so forth.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways there with the photos to help avoid the risk that they're referring to is that think detail, get close, rather than standing well back from your subject, so that you're only looking at exactly what you're trying to photograph.
Yes, exactly. Tony Julian says, I've worked the last 3 years for an owner doing QC inspections. AIA identifies AE general inspections, but not thorough inspection. And the owner AE agreement could be modified. That's true. That, of course, the definition of inspection in the A201, which he goes on to talk about, requires the contractor inspect work prior to proceeding, but little in the specs on how it's documented. But also the A201 only defines 2 inspections, and for substantial completion and for final completion, and all the other activities of the architect are observations, and primarily that's to provide a reasonable limit to liability for what we can and can't see.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about this slide here that we have up on the screen. And we've already talked about who's providing the inspection, so I don't think we need to dwell on that. But I do think we need to talk about how some of these tests and inspections are done. I look at the specifications that identify some of the tests, or identify, say, a reference standard that defines a test. And some of what happens is that we are not being 100% complete in what the contractor needs or what the test agency needs to actually conduct the test, and then defining what constitutes acceptable results. One of the things that comes to mind is the air and water tests for exterior glazing assemblies. So if we rely on AMA, they set the test pressures as 2/3 of the design test pressure. Is that going to be acceptable for the particular project? If we don't say so, that's what the contractor or the test agency will use. So we need to be careful about how we're specifying that requirement and consider whether or not 2/3 of a lab test is really sufficient. Is it practical to expect the field test to match identically the lab test? So I think there are a lot of considerations as to how you apply these test requirements.
We all know that certain products, especially sound control products, the tests that are done in the laboratory, you're not going to be able to get the same results if you test them in the field. And so we have to come up with something that is a practical measure. But like, as you say, depending upon how critical the installation is, for example, if you have your example of Windows, if you're doing Windows for an electronic data center that is absolutely mission critical, and if any water gets into the building, could compromise what's going on inside, then yes, you may want to test it at the full pressure rather than just 2/3.
Correct. And there are a number of things that we could do too, is that we can adjust what is the acceptable result, even though we're defining perhaps a lab condition for the product testing initially, or for the manufacturer certification as to performance. We can adjust the result and the acceptance criteria and even the test criteria for field conditions to make it more practical. And I put in here measurable and repeatable. We certainly can't ask to inspect something that we really cannot practically measure. If it's purely subjective, that there's no way to be able to hold the contractor accountable, because he doesn't know how or by what means you're going to use to accept or reject the work.
Yes, and some things, there used to be a test for the static coefficient of friction for flooring products, but you could only do it in the laboratory, and even when you did it in the laboratory, your one lab might get one result and another lab might get another, because it wasn't a very scientific test, and hence it's been withdrawn. So it does have to be both measurable and repeatable. Kevin O'Barron has a couple of really good points that I thought I'd share. He said, one, it's essential for the specifier to fully understand the testing being required, particularly when a reference standard is the basis for the required field quality control, and to be aware of the options and limitations on said testing, which we've just discussed. And two, it's critical for the specifier to indicate the conditions of the test, and perhaps most important, the criteria for acceptance and the consequences of failure. Many specs do not do this.
Wait a minute, Kevin. Did you somehow get a hold of this presentation? Are you reading our minds? Okay, so we should invite you to present one of the next slides that we have, the one following this one. Okay, so what are we expecting out of all these tests and inspections, Les?
Well, we're expecting some paper, electronic or other, or physical paper, and these different submittals that are either informational submittals if they come in before closeout, or there are closeout submittals. And in both cases, they're for record purposes rather than necessarily we're checking them for accuracy. They're not action submittals.
Now, I want to ask you about the last one, this third-party warranties. Why would this be a submittal under field quality control?
Oh, it's not. These are just,
okay.
This is just, but to get, this is the point where we're trying to get with our field quality control procedures.
Aha. Okay, and I want to say something about the supplemental instructions.
Yes.
This is something that I actually, when I'm specifying a manufacturer or a product rep or someone of that kind, provide inspection on the site, I'm actually requiring that whatever supplemental instructions they issue for the particular project conditions, that become a submittal, because I want a record of what the installer was actually instructed to do.
Oh, that's a good point. Throughout master spec, it stresses over and over, whenever it says comply with manufacturer instructions, it always says manufacturer's written instructions. So, but
if we have the field rep, they may not be written.
That's true, but they should be, if it says anything of significance, that should be written and documented so that there's a record of what the contractor was told to do. Because we often get into this with the field testing of windows, as we've talked about before, that sometimes they have to take the window apart or even take it back out of the hole and adjust the installation requirement, the installation procedures, so that it will in fact pass the testing. And all of that obviously needs to be recorded.
Yeah, because if it's not and you have to make that adjustment elsewhere, how do you know what to do?
Yeah. So shall we get Kevin to...
Yeah, so Kevin, do you want to present this slide?
Just stick up your hand and talk to us.
Yeah, so we do all the testing, we do all the inspection, and what happens when it goes wrong? I mean, we really need to think about, and we should probably specify, especially if it's got some dire consequences, if we're talking about building enclosure or if we're talking about some mission critical element of the project, what are the consequences when this thing goes wrong, and who owns the responsibility for making it right? We've got one consideration with all of this is when we put the owner into the mix, that the owner, even though something may be defective, can actually elect to accept it.
Yes, that's even embodied in the A201.
Right. Well, and hopefully with some monetary consequence, because he's accepting something that is not meeting the contract document, so there's got to be some compensation to make up for that.
One would think so. And of course, another consequence is that if something needs to have remedial action and then be retested, it's usual and customary that the cost of the retesting has to be borne by the contractor.
Right. So the consequences, what are they? Removal, replacement, repair. It could be any number of things. And one of the things that is coming up more and more is with the building envelope and air tightness. If we perform a blower door test after the bulk of the facility is constructed, what's the consequence there?
I have no idea. I'm eagerly awaiting your answer to that question.
Well, first you need to think about these kinds of tests and say, when are you going to perform them? So do you do one test at the end? I would say no. You do multiple tests as you go along. You do your basic sheathing and framing. Maybe you close up the window openings. You don't even install the windows. Let's take a baseline test, cut the windows in, install the windows, take another test. Did you install the windows correctly? Are you getting the right performance? Maybe then you start installing the cladding materials and test again.
Have you actually done worked on projects that were done that way?
We have specified it that way. Whether or not it was done that way, can't rightly say.
I hear that. I hear that. We haven't got into we have not done a project to knowledge where the air barrier was tested in that manner.
Yeah, we've been actually building field mock-ups and require the mock-up to be constructed in phases and tested in phases. So build the backup, install the sheathing if it's metal stud, install the weather barrier, test it.
Well, it'd certainly be to the contractor's advantage to test it then when they can fix it, rather than after the brick and the ACM have been installed over the top of the drainage cavity.
Right, and then we would tell them, okay, the next step, install all the veneer anchors or whatever is holding the cladding on and test it. Then come back and install the insulation, the cladding, and everything else that goes, and test again.
Interesting. Well, that would certainly give you some meaningful results.
It has worked. It has given the architect a little bit better assurance that
before you go on, if you would back up just a second.
Oh, sure.
Tony Julian had a comment, well, actually on the previous slide, but that's all right. He says, going back a slide, a recurring issue I've encountered is that many manufacturer requirements are identified as recommendations rather than shall imperative statements. And relative to non-conforming work, thoughts on manufacturers waiving shall installment requirements in writing at request of contractor to work around non-conformance. I haven't run into that, Tony. Do you have something specific in mind? Perhaps you could share with us? He says yes. Well,
okay.
You want to raise your hand and tell us your war story?
Either that or he's busily typing.
Oh, we'd love to hear your voice.
I was just going to say, Tony, I did unmute your line, so hopefully you have the ability to speak. So if you want to try, Tony.
Okay, we cannot pressure him into joining the conversation.
Well, we're getting close to the hour anyway. Kevin O'Byrne has a note about defective work. He says, I'm a wastewater engineer. That's a service that my firm also provides, Kevin. When we have, say, a 2,000 horsepower pump that has too much vibration at the site or is somehow otherwise not passing field tests, what happens next could be troublesome. If we take the pump out and return it to the factory, there's a huge cost and the work will be significantly delayed. Such defects are always thorny in a process-type industry project and perhaps others as well.
I guess I would ask Kevin, because that was one of my jobs also in another lifetime in wastewater. For critical elements like that, are you often even requiring, instead of field quality control, shop quality control to test things like these pumps, especially these large pumps, to make sure that they're performing properly? Yeah, before they're even shipped.
Yeah. Source quality control, as they call it.
Right. And there's his answer, yes. And they probably worked perfectly in the shop, didn't they?
Probably so.
Okay.
And here's Tony sharing his war story. SIP board was allowed to get wet versus standard written instructions, and the manufacturer waived and had to replace the entire roof as it became ripe with mold. Okay. So,
that is a war story. Gosh.
That is definitely a story of great import.
Okay, so we wanted to, I think we're near the end here, Louis, and we wanted to talk a little bit about manufacturer services, and I
which
think
was
manufacturers,
actually
the whole point.
Rich's original, Rich Freewald's original question was
Right.
just about this.
And
So we
and
put
it
it
is,
all up, but he hasn't
yeah.
arrived yet.
Okay, so it is confusing, I think, and I went back and I actually looked at master spec, and I'll bring that point up here in a minute, but who's actually providing the manufacturer services is one aspect, and then what exactly are they doing is the other. Manufacturer services, we could have an independent product representative, someone that might actually represent multiple product lines. We could have an employee product representative, one that actually works directly for a manufacturer. We could have a technical representative. We can have an authorized agent, a factory trained agent. And the puzzle, when I went back to look at master spec, is they list two different types. They have a manufacturer's technical representative, and then they have a factory authorized service representative. And I'm still puzzled about the distinction, because the technical representative is, by the qualification statement and master spec, is able to observe and inspect, where the factory trained service rep is only allowed to inspect.
Whatever that means.
Yes, and so I'm not really sure what that distinction is, or how master spec thinks that they have this segregated, that you need both kinds of representation from a manufacturer, and what they would expect one to do as opposed to the other. Maybe the service representative is really more geared towards equipment. The manufacturer's representative could be geared to any kind of a product. So if somebody out there in our audience has a good answer to that, that would be a big help. So
we did talk earlier earlier in the day, when David and I were talking about this presentation, we did talk about the difference between a manufacturer's technical representative who inspects work to make sure that it's installed correctly, and a different type of technical representative who is authorized to train the owner's staff in the operation of complex equipment, for example.
Right, because
they're not necessarily the same person.
Right, so that goes into what kinds of services are we expecting, and are we actually selecting the right kind of person from the manufacturer's side to assist with those services. So, because we have the periodic inspections, thinking about roofing, we probably want somebody there from the manufacturer at a pre-installation meeting, perhaps in the first week of installation, make sure everything is going well, perhaps weekly or monthly, depending upon the size of the roof as work goes along, and again at the end for a final inspection for things like warranty compliance.
We had a couple of comments that may clarify our discussion. Heath Waldorf says, what about when the manufacturer certified rep is the installer himself? And of course, the whole point of most of these field quality control requirements is to get somebody else to look at the work other than the person who's doing it. So that I haven't run into that, Heath, but we may need to clarify that from time to time in the specifications. Dennis Elroyd suggests that the difference between the factory authorized agent and the factory trained agent is that one might be employed by the first might be employed by the manufacturer, the second is not, but merely trained.
Akin to the product rep, the independent or the employee. Okay, right. That's a good explanation.
Or maybe it's the other way around too. Another Flori Grottoli asks, if a specific paint type is specified for interior millwork and a sample submitted for approval, how do you know that the finished material specified is the material actually being used on the project? Are MSD submittals customary and enough to avoid liability issues? Well, we'll answer that second question first, is that our advice is not to accept MSD submittals at all, because they deal with the safety of the use of the product. They don't really deal with the product itself. I have sometimes, for example, water repellents are water clear and they don't add a sheen to the building. So if you go out, you can't tell what's been treated or not unless you throw a hose on it. And so there have been times where, for products like that, I have asked to have a bill of lading or something to prove that the right amount of quantity of product was shipped to the site. And then you can have the manufacturer's rep look at it and say, yeah, 300 gallons, that should do it.
Do you count the cans?
And that's another way. But, you know, that's a good question. There's a certain, that's why we have submittals, for one thing, but it wouldn't be the first time that we've approved a submittal and you go out on the job site and instead of the submittal that you approve, they bought something else and are trying to put it on the wall. It does happen.
Yep. So Louis, are you relying on manufacturers to actually provide the last three items, the startup, commissioning, and training, as part of their services, or is this something that you're often going out to independents?
The training, yes, and the startup, yes, but not commissioning. Normally you want an independent person to, because that has to do with adjusting things, and it may have to do with adjusting work that's not, and items that are not supplied by the primary manufacturer. In other words, if you have a startup of the HVAC system, the controls might be coming from a different manufacturer, and the commissioning agent has to adjust the controls plus the operation of the actual equipment.
Maybe I worded it badly. Would you require the manufacturer to provide services during the commissioning process for that adjustment?
Oh, well, it's the contractors to provide them. Now, whether, I don't know that, I'd have to ask one of my mechanical engineers.
I'm thinking about Kevin and his 2,000 horsepower pump.
I have to ask one of my water service engineers about that question.
I know I would prefer to have the manufacturer there if he had to make an alignment adjustment between the pump and the motor. I would like to have the manufacturer there.
Yes.
So that I don't destroy the bearings.
All right. And just to remind folks that under the what line, there's, you know, if you have a critical roof or a very complex roof or a very large roof, you may want to require periodic inspections and not just one final warranty inspection for the roofing. And of course that can apply to other products as well, but that's one of those things that you can use to adjust the level of assurance that you're going to get from whether it's an independent inspector or it's the manufacturer. Well, that brings us to the end of the hour. And
it does.
Again, we want to thank Rich Freewalt for the inspiration for this topic. And I'm sorry he missed it live, but he and other folks can listen to the recordings that will be available probably early next week. And this just shows to, you know, David and I have always felt for the last 5.5 years that we've been doing this, almost 6 years, that this really belongs to the group. And if you have something that you would like us to discuss and some subject that you'd like us to tackle and perhaps even help us with, please let us know. We don't have anything specific lined up for next month. We are at some point in the near future, one of our upcoming sessions, to do something on slip resistance, but that's just in the early planning stages. So if you have some ideas, keep the cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors.
And we'll see you here again next month, July 7th.
July 7th.
We're a couple days after the holiday, so everybody ought to be done with their picnic by then and able to join us. Look forward to having you with us then.
Great. Thanks for everyone for coming and spending time with us.